Good morning, everyone. Father Bob Gross here. I hope you're having a very good day. Today's Tuesday, September 10th. It's around close to noontime, and I'm talking to you from my new office over in Newman Hall. And the reason why is because we have invited and we have a new staff member that have joined our four parish staff, and that is Miss Yvette Anderson. She's our new Director of Faith Formation, and because Patty Frana is taking on her new position as pastoral minister, we decided that maybe the two of them would like to share an office. And that allows me to have this office across the way. Here's my office, here's my office, here's my office, and there's Jesus. And so I'm getting used to that. Had to do a little moving, which always gives you a chance to kind of slim down some things. So I just want to share what I shared on Sunday with the gospel and the readings of this last weekend. And sometimes Jesus's words just slap us in the face, really. And today's gospel, or last Sunday's gospel, was, unless you hate your father and mother, wife and children, brother and sister, and even your own life, you cannot be my disciple. Anyone who does not take up their cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. Anyone who does not renounce all his possessions cannot be my disciple. It's tough. And today I just want to look at, what does that really mean? What is Jesus really getting at? And I really think it's another example of Jesus fulfilling the law. We hear that Jesus did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. This comes to a basic insight about the difference between the Old Testament and the New. And here's that point. The Old Testament was about the law, knowing what pleases God. And it was about fidelity to that law. And it ended up being over 600 laws, that if you kept those 600 laws, you were righteous. Those that did not keep the laws were sinners. It became very clear about what it meant to be a follower and what it meant to be unfaithful. But with Jesus coming, he showed us that what has happened in the people of Israel up to his time was that the law unfortunately became an idol. That it was just this slavish fidelity to the law, but forgot the reason why we are faithful to the law, and that is to be in relationship with God. So Jesus was about us being in relationship with God. The healing of our broken relationship. That's what Jesus really is all about, being in relationship with his Father. And instead of the law transforming us from outside in, Jesus wants to give us the Holy Spirit to transform us inside out. And it's boiled down to gospel attitudes, that we can live the reality of the kingdom of God now by living the gospel attitudes that Jesus gave. So here are some that we typically hear, and last week we heard one of the most important ones, and that is the gospel attitude of humility. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, but whoever humbles himself will be exalted. Another one is poverty of spirit, the first beatitude, that we live in complete and utter dependence upon God, that self-sufficiency is an illusion. Another one would be the love of enemies. Enemy love being an attitude that we have that stops violence if we faithfully live it. Another would be living the virtues, loving the good things in this world, but putting them in proper order. Living the virtues, forgiveness, chastity, justice, temperance. Those are the attitudes that then change the way we think, influence how we feel, and ultimately direct the actions that we do in life. Today's gospel is another example of a gospel attitude, and that is renunciation. Renunciation, or another word would be detachment, is one of the essential gospel attitudes that we have. And here's the main point of why we need to be detached, why we need to practice renunciation, is because even good things get in the way of our relationship with God. And Jesus points to two of those in our lives: family and our possessions. Family is a good. Honor your father and your mother. The gifts that we receive from God are good. But there is this tendency in this fallen world for those things to replace the first place that God needs to take in our lives. That we will only love our family properly and lovingly and in God if we first renounce our family. That we will only love the things that we have in our life properly if we first renounce them as an act of placing God first in our lives. So that's the phone. They'll get it. And that's the point that we many times struggle with. It's one thing to do good and to avoid evil. It's another thing when good starts to tempt our relationship with God. And we see that in very many practical ways, when people, in a sense, can turn family into idols. Family first, family first, family first, family first. But family can't be first unless God is first. That's the basic point that Jesus is getting at today. So to illustrate that point, I want to share an episode from one of the great saints, St. Francis of Assisi. And when we think of St. Francis of Assisi, we typically see him in gardens, statues of him in gardens, holding a dove, petting a dog. St. Francis had this deep connection with God, and in that led him to a great love of creation. But we sometimes forget that St. Francis is one of the great saints of renunciation, renouncing everything to place God first. So Francis was born in a very wealthy family in the town of Assisi in Italy. His father was one of the leading cloth merchants in the region. So you basically had to go to his dad to get your clothes. And cloth was very expensive to make, very difficult to craft, just like it is today. And his father became a very successful merchant, became very rich. And he loved his son, wanted his son to be successful, and he also spoiled his son. So his son was a rich kid. He had everything that he ever wanted. Loved the party, loved to be with his friends, was just involved in just the daily pursuits of life, the pleasures of life. Then around the age of 21, 22, St. Francis started to listen to the words of the gospel, started to attend Mass more devoutly, listening, going to confession, praying more. And over the course of a time of 3 years, St. Francis was converted more to the Lord. He experienced the Lord's love even more for him, and he wanted to return it back with love. So one day, he was riding on his horse in his really nice outfit, with his really nice hat, with his really nice sword on his belt, and he came across a leper. And leprosy was one of the great scourges of the Middle Ages, the scourges during the time of Jesus. It was a death sentence. It's like getting the Ebola virus. It's like getting HIV/AIDS. And people avoided lepers at all costs because it was so contagious. But as he encountered that leper, he had a change of heart. He saw Jesus in that leper, and he got off his horse, embraced the leper, kissed the leper, kissed his wounds, and started to serve the lepers that lived on the outskirts of Assisi. Do you know what his dad thought of all that? His dad lost his stack. Got so angry at him. I'm going to give this business for you. What if you die and lose your health? Who am I going to give this cloth business to? I'm doing this for you. And St. Francis ignored his dad. Then a year later, several months later, he was praying in a very small chapel that was literally falling apart. And there's a famous cross that you can see there today, the San Damiano cross. And while he was praying, he heard a voice come from the cross. And it was Jesus saying, "Francis, rebuild my church." And Francis took those words literally, that he was supposed to rebuild the little chapel. So do you know what he did? He took cloth from his father's clothing store, sold it, and used the proceeds to get bricks and mortar. Then he saw a horse that his father had not been using, which belonged to him. And St. Francis sold the horse, and used the proceeds to buy those things that he needed to rebuild the chapel. His father found out, and he was furious. He was so furious that he had St. Francis arrested and brought before the Bishop of Assisi to force him to give back all that he took from his father and gave it back to his father. And that was the moment of truth for his life, because at that moment, he gave the money back to his father, took off the clothes that his father gave them, and gave them back to his father. And in his nakedness, before the bishop and before his father, he said, "You are no longer my father. My Father is our Father in heaven." And the bishop saw that it was a genuine call from the Lord, and he covered Francis with his cape. And from that moment on, Francis lived a life of poverty. Later in his life, he wanted to reconcile with his father, but his father did not have the ability to forgive. That's an example of renouncing your family for the kingdom. He made a very clear statement that nothing was going to get in his way in following the Lord's call, even in the trial and errors that came with his discernment of what God was asking him to do. Because it wasn't rebuilding a small chapel. Francis was to start a religious order that was going to renew and to rebuild the spiritual bricks of the church. Let's face it, family and the good things in life can get in the way of our relationship with God. That's what Jesus is getting at today. So how does family creep in? Is it the family farm that you got to keep going at all costs? Is it the nice car and the nice truck that you bought? Is it having those family gatherings on the weekends at the expense of worshiping God at Mass? Is it living for things instead of living for God? Those are all the things, if we are brutally honest with ourselves, that creep in to our relationships with God, our relationship with God. And Jesus is saying, and he's using very strong language, you got to renounce it so you can love it properly. Renounce your family so that you can love your family properly in my love. Renounce all of your possessions so that you can properly use them for my glory. St. Ignatius would use the word indifferent. We must be indifferent to these things so that we do not become indifferent to God. So those are some thoughts that I think that come from the gospel. Sorry, I'm going a little bit long. And I hope it helps you in your relationship with God. And may God bless you.